Yeah, well, thank you, Andrew, and thanks, Lonnie, for this invitation. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you are at your lunch, eating lunch, and joining us. Thank you for doing that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, why I teach 1984, just briefly before I get into the actual presentation. So as Andrew mentioned, this is a text that a lot of our students have already encountered, potentially in high school or earlier. And I usually start by telling my students that when I first read the book, I had a paperback version, and on the very front of the first page, I gave it a C-/D grade and said, "Not much here, frowny face." And so that was about, 17 years ago. And first of all, I'm not sure why I was grading books like that, but, I did. And of course, I went back and reread it since then. And now I think not only is it, an A+ book, but I think everybody else should read it. But I've always been confused about why I did not find it appealing when I was, in high school. And I think part of it is potentially about I found it too depressing. I might have thought, it was too obvious. And so one reason why I'm excited to talk to you today is perhaps to show you that there are two readings of 1984. And it's not all doom and gloom. There's actually a very strong, hopeful story that is hidden and layered throughout the text. And one reason that we can sort of use the idea of cornerstone and critical reading together is to try to recover that second hidden sort of ending, meaning of the book. But I just always like to start off by telling my students that, look, when I was their age, I thought this was not that great. And I changed my mind, and I hope to do the same thing for them. So starting a little bit of context about what this is, and I have sort of given a lot of excerpts. So I think you'll find that in the chat, the sort of full PDF of all the stuff. And I'm using this 1984 edition, and that's where the excerpts are from. So for me, the book published in 1949, 3 years after the end of World War II. This is Orwell's most widely read and referenced book of the 20th century. Many of our students have encountered this already in high school. So again, how can a cornerstone sensibility reveal new meanings when they reread it in college? So I will focus on two themes, great power and resistance, that I use to teach, hopefully in a fresh, even subversive way. So you might already be familiar, but just some sort of plot summary here, that the book is about Winston Smith and his time in a future London society ruled by a government in Oceania, which is a superstate. And Winston works for the party in its Ministry of Truth to constantly alter the past so the party is never wrong. He is surrounded by surveillance from telescreens and audio bugs in his home and place of work. His language is constrained by newspeak, and his memories is not the same, and his thoughts are jumbled. He has an ulcer, his food is bland, and his gin is slimy. So we know all of this in the first opening pages of the book. But the book also starts with his rebellion. So Winston opens a diary and starts writing his thoughts. And so when we have this regime where basically any deviation from full devotion and obedience to the party is harshly punished, he is able to steal some time away from the ever-watching Big Brother, or so he thinks. He also briefly finds love with Julia, who is another skeptical party official, and one day passes a love note to Winston, but ultimately he is betrayed by O'Brien, whom he considers an ally in the secretive brotherhood. But after severe torture under O'Brien in the last third of the book, Winston overcomes his thought crimes to love Big Brother. So 1984 is thought basically as a critique. We often think it's a critique of communism, especially because Big Brother has sort of broad shoulders and a mustache that sort of looks like Stalin. But a lot of people have said that it would sort of be unfortunate if we did not interpret Orwell to not just talk about stuff going on over there, but actually how it actually affects us too. And in fact, Orwell saw himself writing for democratic socialism. And he wanted to reflect on great power in our societies and in his own time. He was not only concerned with the simple exercise of power of one over another, but he was interested in uncovering our complicity in how we submit to all-encompassing great power. And so when we think about how 1984 might be relevant, we have sort of indicators today. We see it in us voluntarily sharing private information with companies like Facebook, or sort of inviting telescreens and audio bugs of our devices into our homes. We also see it in sort of conventional government surveillance programs. We see it in the idea of misinformation and sort of disinformation and alternate facts. So all of these parallels to today are what makes the book, relevant for new readers. And we also see the use of Orwellian, right? The idea that things are Orwellian. So we often hail Orwell for sort of anticipating this future in 1949. But I think there's even something more about just sort of the technology and how it plays a role in surveillance. I think there's something about how he thought about power and how to resist that power that is also really relevant today. And so just sort of a brief overview of Orwell's life, which I think is relevant. He was born in 1903 in colonial India. He attended boarding school in England, graduated from Eton, and went back to the colonies as part of the Burmese Indian Imperial Police in 1921. So he's had firsthand experience of being part of an imperialist surveillance state. But he did quit 5 years later and started his life as a writer. He worked in London and Paris. But soon after, he went and fought in the Spanish Civil War, where he was shot in the neck. So now he's had firsthand experience fighting a fascist army. And all of this is sort of recounted in his earlier work as well. After he came back from Spain, he joined the BBC Eastern Service during World War II, and this is when he first published Animal Farm. He died, unfortunately, at the age of 46 of tuberculosis, just 1 year after 1984 was published. So he did not live on to see all the ways in which the book influenced people. And so I think it is useful for us to think about Orwell as being part of a colonial state enterprise in India, and then also part of an anti-colonial, anti-fascist movement in Spain. And his experiences perhaps inform some of these themes of great power and great resistance that come out in 1984. So let's turn to our excerpts. So I have, again, given a lot here in the PDF, but I'm going to sort of move along and kind of skip a little bit, but I just want to make sure I flagged the actual text that I'm talking about. So when you and if you teach the book, you sort of know what passages are sort of relevant for power and resistance work. So on page 28, we see Winston writing in his diary. And again, he's already open, he's already shared about his ulcers, right? How the food is bland. And sort of in the middle of the paragraph on 28, he first starts by talking about how for him, it's not just death, but annihilation, and that the diary would be reduced to ashes and himself to vapor. So he already knows that the consequences of his actions are strong, right? This is the idea of great power, surveillance. He's going to be found out and he's going to be dead. There's no question about that for him. Skipping down a little bit to the next paragraph, Winston thought of himself that he was a lonely ghost who was uttering a truth that nobody would ever hear. But as long as he uttered it in some obscure way, the continuity was not broken. On the next page, on 29, at the very top, he talks about he was already dead, he reflected. Moving down a little bit, now that he thought of himself as a dead man, it became important to stay alive as long as possible. So these couple of pages really reflect the opening stakes of the book, right? That Winston is not just writing a diary, but the act of writing the diary is already a thought crime. So he has already committed one of the gravest things that he can against great power. And for this, he knows he will be dead. But now that he is dead, it is important to stay alive as long as possible. So these kinds of contradictions are very they're kind of a feature of the writing of the book. So they're usually great conversation starters. I ask students, well, what does that mean to be a lonely ghost? What does it mean to stay alive as long as possible? And why would Winston, when he knows that he was going to be a dead man, why does he start writing in the first place? So that usually opens up a lot of conversation with students about sort of his state of mind, so is Winston not well? Is he thinking that he can actually make a difference? So what is the sort of motivation behind him sort of marching into his death willingly? And again, it also sets up the stakes of great power, because we know that he's aware of what's facing him. And yet Winston does not shrink into oblivion. And so again, the power resistance stories are with us from the very beginning of the book. And then also we have work about thought crime and doublethink in these early pages. And these concepts are really core to 1984. And students often have a pretty good idea of what thought crime means. It's the idea of doublethink that is actually sort of challenging. And I'll talk more in the Q&A if you like about how to sort of introduce the idea of doublethink to students. And actually, it's kind of interesting, right, that even sort of grasping doublethink is in some ways difficult, which is part of doublethink. But anyway, so we get these concepts early on in these passages, and we get the stakes of the story early on. Skipping to sort of our next excerpt on page 71. So here again, we start thinking about resistance. So it's one thing to sort of focus on all the details of this life in 1984, how there's constant surveillance, not just from the devices, but from the children. Remember, basically all the kids are kind of marching around and they're like hyper, and they're spying on their parents and their neighbors. So we have not just tech intelligence, but also human intelligence. But even amongst all of this setting, we have examples of potential resistance. So in 71, at the beginning of this section 7, so Winston is back writing in his diary, and here he wrote that if there is hope, it lies in the proles. Okay, so it's useful to provide some context that Orwell, when he's saying proles, he's really talking about the proletariat, the idea of the working class, which in his time, people would have probably gotten that reference more easily than in our time. So it's helpful to sort of provide that context for students. And we also learn a little bit more about how great power in 1984 is basically extreme minority rule, where almost 15% of party members are against 85% of the masses. And then this passage gives us an idea that inspiring the proles is perhaps their best chance to resist great power. But it is not easy. So we start thinking about this here, about who the proles are. And at the very bottom of this page, of page 71, but the proles, if only they could somehow become conscious of their own strength, would have no need to conspire. They need only to rise up and shake themselves like a horse shaking off flies. If they chose, they could blow the party to pieces tomorrow morning. Surely, sooner or later, it must occur to them to do it. And yet, and so just in terms of sheer numbers, you have 85% of the masses versus 15% of the party. And Winston thinks that there has to be a way in which these people are going to rise up, and because of their sheer scale, they're going to destroy the party. But he thinks a little bit more, and he thinks maybe it's not going to be so easy. So in 73, at the very top of the page, he writes, until they become conscious, they will never rebel. And until after they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious. So another one of these phrases that Orwell likes, which is a built-in contradiction that is great for starting conversations, especially at the beginning of class. And so here, of course, he's talking about how oftentimes people are not aware of their oppression, right? The idea of false consciousness, even when you have great power exerted on you. There's a lot of other sort of great theories of power that help us think about why people might be in these situations. But it's a fairly standard way to think about, right? That how do you know you are not doing well. And how does one rebel when one is not aware of their own oppression? And so for Winston, this is sort of the key, is how do you inspire the proles to first acknowledge that they are in this structure, and then second, try to work to dismantle the structure. So again, sort of hints of Marxism here and thinking about proles, working class, right? All of that stuff is coming through. A little bit down the page on 73, we learn more about why the proles are the way they are in this society. So towards the very bottom, Winston thought that basically to keep them in control was not difficult. We had a few agents of the thought police, moved always among them. They were spreading false rumors and marking down and taking off the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. But no attempt was made to indoctrinate them with the ideology of the party. So that's the first sort of point that you could ask students about, well, if the party is so all-seeing and really cares about making sure everybody follows what they want to do, why would they not care about the proles also following party ideology? So then we continue on here, that it was not desirable that the proles should have strong political feelings. All that was required of them was a primitive patriotism, which could be appealed to whenever it was necessary to make them accept longer working hours or shorter rations. And even when they became discontented, as they sometimes did, their discontent led nowhere, because being without general ideas, they could only focus it on petty, specific grievances. The larger evils invariably escaped their notice. And at the very bottom of that paragraph, basically, we have a party slogan: proles and animals are free. So proles are not brainwashed in the same way as we have party members like Winston and Julia through the 2 minutes hate that we hear also in the book. They're not surveilled in their homes through telescreens. It's basically too costly for that. Instead, they are kept distracted. They are free to not be considered political, so that their discontent could never have a target and thus go nowhere. I also have students think about all the other ways in which the masses are distracted in society. So later on, when we meet Julia, we learn that she basically works in porn sec, and we have the idea of mass entertainment and porn and all these other ideas of false rumors. And of course, we have the lottery for the proles, right? So we have sort of mass entertainment to numb the mind, and sort of a rigged scheme to give hope for better tomorrow. So like the idea of sort of thinking about circus, right? And having students think of other examples. Today, we have mass circus or mass distractions or mass entertainment, which is keeping the proles, or the masses, think that they're not actually oppressed. And so thinking about proles as being hope, having the sort of masses on their side, having the numbers, but also then again, we have the power, we have the control over, well, what do they actually see? What do they actually know about? So all of this again goes back to this tension between power and resistance. Skipping a little bit forward to 82, this is our next passage. So for now, we know the party has these strategies of control. We know there's surveillance. We know that there's sort of mind control. We know there's newspeak and language limitation. We know the proles are sort of distracted. And so on 82, Winston is writing in the diary that I understand how, right, the strategies of power, but I do not understand why. And so now he's trying to reflect on what this control does to people. And this to me is one of the central parts of 1984. It's not just the fact that we have these technologies, but what is their essential purpose? So the bottom of the page. So he picked up the children's history book and looked at the portrait of Big Brother, which formed its frontispiece. We have the hypnotic eyes gazed into his own. It was as though some huge force was pressing down upon you. something that penetrated inside your skull, battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. So this idea of immense power, right? This is great power battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs. So a very famous passage here, right? That the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. He goes on to talk about, on page 83, they might be right. For after all, how do we know that 2 and 2 make 4? Or that the force of gravity works? Or that the past is unchangeable? If both the past and the external world exist only in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? So these are all examples here where Orwell is focusing not just on what great power does in terms of the actual tactics, but also how it is felt and experienced by people and the kinds of feelings it might generate in ordinary individuals. And again, the bottom of the page on 83, so the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. His heart sank as he thought of the enormous power arraigned against him, the ease with which any party intellectual would overthrow him in debate, the subtle arguments which he would not be able to understand, much less answer. So great power, right? And yet he was in the right. They were wrong and he was right. The obvious, the silly, and the true had got to be defended. Truisms are true. Hold on to that. The solid world exists. Its laws do not change. Stones are hard, water is wet, objects unsupported fall towards the earth's center. With the feeling that he was speaking to O'Brien, and also that he was setting forth an important axiom, he wrote, "Freedom is a freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." So here, again, importantly, we have dueling undercurrents of great power and resistance, where we have Winston asserting he is right and that the true has got to be defended. And importantly, Winston draws a direct connection between freedom of being and freedom of thought. Whereas earlier the party said the proles were free, as in largely left alone, Winston knows that definition of freedom is a manipulation. For him, true freedom is to possess one's own critical thought and be able to express it, even in the face of great power. So, but there are different types of great power. We get also different types of resistance. So Winston is doing this. He's trying to wrestle with what this means, what is the purpose of power. And then we also get some kinds of pushback from Julia, and then we have this really great dialogue between them when they're trying to figure out how much resistance is enough. And so skipping to 158, our next passage, we have Winston recalling this photograph he saw of some people which he knew that the party didn't want him to know was real. And so him and Julia are having a conversation about what this photograph means and these 3 people who are in it. So he tried to make her understand. This was an exceptional case. It wasn't just a case of somebody being killed. Do you realize that the past, starting from yesterday, has been actually abolished? If it survives anywhere, it's in a few solid objects with no words attached to them, like that lump of glass there. Already we know almost literally nothing about the revolution and the years before the revolution. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street and building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And that process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. The only evidence is inside my own mind, and I don't know with any certainty that any other human being shares my memories. So once again, we have this idea of social isolation, and this is the kind of feeling of great power that is engendered by not just surveillance, but this idea of people questioning their own reality, questioning whether or not they can trust their own mind, and if anybody else shares that mistrust. But Julia hasn't followed all that through. So she argues, so she said, well, okay, you can think about all this on 159, but what good was that? Well, it was no good because I threw it away a few minutes later, but if the same thing happened today, I should keep it. This is a photograph. Well, I wouldn't, said Julia. I am quite ready to take risks, but only for something worthwhile, not for bits of old newspaper. And then later on, we have this sort of back and forth. And then Winston says that you're only a rebel from the waist downwards. So again, this is a very provocative statement and something that we have students really respond to pretty well. There's a lot going on here in terms of gender politics, but it also talks a little bit about what it means to resist. If we have different types of power, we might assume different types of resistance. And Julia and Winston are both doing something against the party, but in different ways. We know that Julia is mostly about sexual politics. She's also secured contraband like coffee and chocolate. So in some ways, she's more plugged into networks than Winston is, who is just basically writing a diary at this point. And yet they both have different ways to think about how their individual actions might make a difference. And Winston is perhaps coming closer to grasp this structure that he's in than Julia is, who is very inconvenienced by all the rules that the party has made, and she wants to be a rule breaker, but doesn't quite fully grasp the power structures, right, in the way that he's doing. And so at the bottom of 159, Winston said, talking to her, he realized how easy it was to present an appearance of orthodoxy while having no grasp whatever of what orthodoxy meant. In a way, the worldview of the party imposed itself most successfully on people incapable of understanding it. They could be made to accept the most flagrant violations of reality because they never fully grasped the enormity of what was demanded of them and were not sufficiently interested in public events to notice what was happening. By lack of understanding, they remained sane. They simply swallowed everything, and what they swallowed did them no harm because it left no residue behind, just as a grain of corn will pass undigested through the body of a bird. So this passage is one of the most moving descriptions of thinking about what it means to resist, and how some ideas can be more thinking about as a performance rather than being authentic. And I've used this with students to talk about so-called, wokeness, woke culture. What does it mean if you think somebody's being if somebody's doing, active resistance, if they're doing the work for justice? How do we know when we see it? But here, of course, we have Orwell who's telling us that while the proles are not conscious of their oppression, we have people like Julia who are partly conscious, but think they have it all figured out, and yet are still missing big pieces of this structural power that they are in. And so just as the proles are kind of distracted by entertainment and the lottery, we have Julia who's also sort of mostly satisfied by being a rule breaker here and there, while leaving the structures of power intact. So I also ask people or ask students if we have some ideas of gender here, that Orwell is not being fair to Julia, especially if you think about sexual politics and resistance. And again, it generates a lot of discussion about Winston versus Julia and how they kind of interact with power. So we have different types of power, different types of resistance. And now we move into a couple of weird parts of the book. Not that the book has not already been weird, but one thing that is really interesting about it is how Orwell sort of experiments with different formats. So we move into a book within a book. So on 210, Winston is given this book by Manuel Goldstein to read, to understand more about power. So he's reading this book within a book. It's supposedly written by Goldstein, and Goldstein is sort of describing how power works. And as he's doing that, he is talking a little bit about how all these past modes of power and control were all inefficient. and only the party has decided that they will control most efficiently. So on 211, this is the book talking a little bit about that in the past, no government had the power to keep its citizens under constant surveillance. The invention of print, however, made it easier to manipulate public opinion, and the film and the radio carried the process further. With the development of television and the technical advance, which made it possible to receive and transmit simultaneously on the same instrument, private life came to an end. Every citizen, or at least every citizen important enough to be worth watching, could be kept for 24 hours a day under the eyes of the police and in the sound of official propaganda, with all other channels of communication closed. The possibility of enforcing not only complete obedience to the will of the state, but complete uniformity of opinion on all subjects now existed for the first time. So here we got explicit connections between thinking about technology, surveillance, and thought control, and how we can, and how Orwell is building up to thought control, mind control, and sort of the different ways in which we have human progress, perhaps because of technology, but then we also have control. And so this part, of course, resonates with students a lot, and we think about all the different ways in which they're surveilled in their daily lives, including through, Zoom, including through Brightspace, or there are other sort of learning management systems. Like whenever they take a test now on like Respondus, they have a bunch of their browsers being tracked. So we talk about all of that and how potentially that might lead to the idea of self-disciplining, right? And so bringing up things like Foucault, which we read later in the class, and then they make the connections between those two things. So again, more techniques about power, surveillance. And so here we have these ideas that are moving strong. As we move towards the end of the book, we know that O'Brien has betrayed Winston. So in 272, the passages talk a little bit more about O'Brien trying to talk about why the party exists, so trying again to answer the question that Winston asked, which is, I know how, but why? And so here O'Brien is saying that the party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are not interested in the good of others. We are interested solely in power, not wealth or luxury or long life or happiness, only power, pure power. And so this is also very useful because we try to think about, well, it's not that power is just a mean. Sometimes power is the end. And what does it mean to live in societies like that? And how might we see versions of that reflect in our society, in our time? And so students like to reflect about that and what it means that later on O'Brien calls himself the priest of power, and power is collective. And so all of this, again, is kind of repeating these themes, telling us what it means for Winston to hear them. And then importantly, at one point in this torture interrogation in 278, we have sort of O'Brien saying, look, no one will remember you, you'll be vaporized. All of this is, kind of useless. And yet Winston's resistance is still there. There's like hopes of this that are coming out. And so on 278 at the bottom, Winston says, I don't care, I don't know, or I don't know, I don't care. Somehow you will fail. Something will defeat you. Life will defeat you. And so we have O'Brien saying, well, we control life, Winston, all this other stuff. And so he kind of goes back and talks about this great power, this oppression, but Winston doesn't believe it. He still kind of holds on to something. I know that you will fail. There's something in the universe, I don't know, some spirit, some principle that you will never overcome. Do you believe in God, Winston? No. Then what is it, this principle that will defeat us? I don't know, the spirit of man. Okay, so the spirit of man, right? We come back to humanism. We come back to having trust in something, belief in something, even in the face of unbelievable torture and sort of interrogation. Winston's resistance is still sort of flowing through. But we know at the end, we have sort of this harrowing scene with the rats and all this other stuff that if you know what's coming, it's not great. And we know that the first ending of the book is that Winston is broken. He's loving Big Brother. We think the party has won and that Orwell's book is basically a warning. And maybe there was no point at all to Winston writing a diary in the first place. But like I told you, there's a second ending that Orwell buries in the appendix. Which is why I have assigned, or we have the entire appendix to view here in the excerpts. I won't go through the entire one. I just want to sort of highlight a couple of things here. And so at first glance, this appendix is titled Principles of Newspeak. And it makes it seem like this is something that Orwell is just telling us about how language works. But you'll notice that as soon as you open it, it's in the past tense. Newspeak was the official language of Oceania. And then in the next sentence, in the year 1984, there was not as yet anyone who could use Newspeak, so on and so forth. And in fact, as you keep reading on, it becomes very clear that this appendix is not written by the same narrator as the one in 1984 or in the same time. Instead, it is written by from a time much later, perhaps even in 2023, by some academic who is looking back at the events of 1984. And Orwell embeds many other clues in these final pages that not all is as it seems. He talks about different ideas of present day English. He talks about how there used to be Newspeak, which implied a blind acceptance that was difficult to imagine today. But the strongest hint is the mention of Winston himself, where we know that, again, Winston knew when he was writing the diary that he will be vaporized, he'll be annihilated, nobody will ever remember him. And yet, there he is, appearing very much in the appendix. And so we have this as the second ending we start to realize is what's happening is now we have the Society of 1984 as an object of academic study. It's comparing it to other events like the Third Reich. And it's mentioning Winston, which meant that he was not forgotten by the future. That a boot was not stamping on a human face forever. And so we have this optimistic ending. And actually, Orwell makes a footnote in the very beginning of the novel on page 4. He tells us that if we want an account of Newspeak, we should see the appendix. So if we actually went and saw the appendix on page 4 and started to put the pieces together, that this is all about something that actually ended up going away, that the party actually fell, it might give us an entirely different flavor of reading 1984, when now we're looking for clues of how something like this great power ultimately fell down. And so this is kind of part of an Easter egg hunt for students. And even though I tell them, look, there are 2 endings of the book, you have to read the appendix, most of them are not getting it until we walk through it together. We talk about the past tense, other references that show up that suggest that this is actually part of a future where the party no longer exists, or we have returned to regular speech, we have returned to literature, we've returned to thinking about ourselves as individuals with minds and sort of critical faculties. And ultimately, Orwell suggests that we get the ending we deserve. So for most readers, the book perhaps ends with a defeated, broken, loveless Winston. Either they basically never look at the appendix, or if they do, they don't read it carefully. But for some readers, the book basically ends with the downfall of the party. And we have a restoration of language, of history, of thought, and of Winston's legacy. And Orwell only rewards those who pay attention, those who read carefully, those who like language, who are paying attention to these small details. And ultimately, he thinks in the appendix that what perhaps might have saved society was literature. So the very last paragraph of the appendix, we learn that great books came back. We had some books survived the party, and that not all of them were able to be translated into newspeak. We had Shakespeare, Milton, Swift, Byron, Dickens, all of these kind of survived. And so, of course, maybe there's a hint here in what might have led to the party's downfall were transformative texts, were great books that saved the people, maybe rallied them to thinking differently, to imagining themselves as part of a political resistance. And so that ultimately, to me, is one of the reasons why it's perfect for Cornerstone, because it is about a transformative text and how sometimes even great power can be met with great resistance.